Chapter 13 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 13. After a turn through the shops to assure himself that order was restored, Richard withdrew in the direction of his studio. Margaret was standing at the head of the stairs, half hidden by the scarlet creeper which draped that end of the veranda. "What are you doing here?" said Richard, looking up with a bright smile. "Oh, Richard, I saw it all." "You didn't see anything worth having white cheeks about." "But he struck you with the knife, did he not?" said Margaret, clinging to his arm anxiously. "He didn't have a knife, dear, only a small chisel, which couldn't hurt anyone. See for yourself, it is merely a cat scratch." Margaret satisfied herself that it was nothing more, but she nevertheless insisted on leading Richard into the workshop and soothing the slight inflammation with her handkerchief dipped in arnica and water. The elusive, faint fragrance of Margaret's hair as she busied herself about him would of itself have consoled Richard for a deep wound. All this pretty solicitude and ministration was new and sweet to him, and when the arnica turned out to be cologne and scorched his cheek, Margaret's remorse was so delicious that Richard half wished the mixture had been aqua fortia. "You shouldn't have been looking into the yard," he said. "If I had known that you were watching us it would have distracted me. When I am thinking of you, I cannot think of anything else, and I had need of my wits for a moment." "I happened to be on the veranda, and was too frightened to go away. Why did you quarrel?" In giving Margaret an account of the matter, Richard refrained from any mention of his humiliating visit to Welch's Court that morning. He could neither speak of it nor reflect upon it with composure. The cloud which shadowed his features from time to time was attributed by Margaret to the affair in the yard. "But this is the end of it, is it not?" she asked with troubled eyes. "You will not have any further words with him?" "You needn't worry. If Torrini had not been drinking he would never have lifted his hand against me. When he comes out of his present state he will be heartily ashamed of himself. His tongue is the only malicious part of him. If he hadn't a taste for drink and oratory, if he was not a born orator, as Denevan calls him, he would do well enough." "No, Richard, he's a dreadful man. I shall never forget his face. It was some wild animal's. And you, Richard," added Margaret softly, "it grieved me to see you look like that." "I was wolfish for a moment, I suppose. Things had gone wrong generally. But if you're going to scold me, Margaret, I would rather have some more arnica." "I am not going to scold, but while you stood there, so white and terrible, so unlike yourself, I felt that I did not know you, Richard. Of course you had to defend yourself when the man attacked you, but I thought for an instant you would kill him." "Not I," said Richard uneasily, dreading anything like a rebuke from Margaret. "I am mortified that I gave up to my anger. There was no occasion." "If an intoxicated person were to wander into the yard, Papa would send for a constable and have the person removed." "Your father is an elderly man," returned Richard, not relishing this oblique criticism of his own simpler method. "What would be proper in his case would be considered cowardly in mine. It was my duty to discharge the fellow, and not let him dispute my authority. I ought to have been cooler, of course, but I should have lost caste and influence with the men if I had shown the least personal fear of Torrini. If, for example, I had summoned somebody else to do what I didn't dare do myself. I was brought up in the yard, remember, and to a certain extent I have to submit to being weighed in the yard's own scales." "But a thing cannot be weighed in a scale incapable of containing it," answered Margaret. "The judgment of these rough, uninstructed men is too narrow for such as you. They quarrel and fight among themselves, and have their ideas of daring, but there is a higher sort of bravery, the bravery of self-control, which I fancy they do not understand very well, so their opinion of it is not worth considering. However, you know better than I." "No, I do not," said Richard. "Your instinct is finer than my reason. But you are scolding me, Margaret." "No, I am loving you," she said softly. "How can I do that more faithfully than by being dissatisfied with anything but the best in you?" "I wasn't at my best a while ago?" "No, Richard." "I can never hope to be worthy of you." But Margaret protested against that. Having forced him to look at his action through her eyes, she outdid him in humility, and then the conversation drifted off into half-breathed nothings, which, though they were satisfactory enough for these two, would have made a third person yawn. The occurrence at Slocum's Yard was hotly discussed that night at the Stillwater Hotel. Discussions in that long, low bar-room, where the latest village scandal always came to receive the finishing gloss, were apt to be hot. In their criticism of outside men and measures, as well as in their mutual vivisections, there was an unflinching directness among Mr. Snelling's guests which is not to be found in more artificial grades of society. The popular verdict on young Shackford's conduct was, as might not have been predicted, strongly in his favor. He had displayed pluck, and pluck of the tougher fibre was a quality held in so high esteem in Stillwater that any manifestation of it commanded respect. And young Shackford had shown a great deal. He had made short work of the most formidable man in the yard, and given the rest to understand that he was not to be tampered with. This had taken many by surprise, for hitherto an imperturbable amiability had been the leading characteristic of Slocum's manager. "I didn't think he had it in him," declared Dexter. "Well, you might," replied Michael Hennessy. "Look at the lad's eye and the muscles of him. He stands on his own 2 legs like a monument, so he does." "Never saw a monument with 2 legs, Mike." "Didn't ye? Wait till you're laying at the foot of one. But ye'll wait many a day, my boy. You'll be lucky if you're supplied with a headstone made out of a dale board." "Couldn't get a wooden headstone short of Ireland, Mike," retorted Dexter with a laugh. "You'd have to import it." "And so I will, but it won't be got over in time if you go on interrupting gentlemen when they're discoursing." "What was I saying, anyway? When the blackguard chipped in," continued Mr. Hennessy, appealing to the company, as he emptied the ashes from his pipe by knocking the bowl on the side of his chair. "You was talking of Dick Shackford's muscle," said Durgin, "and you never talked wider of the mark. It doesn't take much muscle, or much courage either, to knock a man about when he's in liquor. The 2 wasn't fairly matched." "You're right there, Durgin," said Stevens, laying down his newspaper. "They weren't fairly matched. Both men have the same pounds and inches, but Torrini had a weapon, and that mad strength that comes to some folks with drink. If Shackford hadn't made a neat twist in the neckerchief, he wouldn't have got off with a scratch." "Shackford had no call to lay hands on him." "There you are wrong, Durgin," replied Stevens. "Torrini had no call in the yard. He was making a nuisance of himself. Shackford spoke to him and told him to go, and when he didn't go, Shackford put him out, and he put him out handsomely, with neatness and dispatch, as Slocum's prospectuses has it." "He was right all the time," said Piggott. "He didn't strike Torrini before or after he was down, and stood at the gate like a gentleman, ready to give Torrini his chance if he wanted it." "Torrini didn't want it," observed Jemmy Wilson. "There isn't nothing mean about Torrini." "But he had a dozen minds about coming back," said Denevan. "We ought to have got him out of the place quietly," said Jeff Stavers. "That was our end of the mistake. He's not a bad fellow, but he shouldn't drink. He was crazy to come to the yard." "When a man has a day off," observed Denevan, "and the beer isn't nasty, he had better stick to the public house." "Oh, you!" exclaimed Durgin. "Your opinion don't weigh. You took a black eye of him." "Yes, I took a black eye, and I can give one in an emergency. Yes, I gives and takes." "That's where we differ," returned Durgin. "I do a more genteel business. I give, and don't take." "Unless you're uncommon careful," said Denevan, pulling away at his pipe, "you'll find yourself some day enlarging your business." Denevan pushed back at his stool. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," interposed Mr. Snelling, appearing from behind the bar with a lemon squeezer in his hand. "We'll have no black eyes here that wasn't born so. I'm partial to them myself when nature gives 'em, and I propose the health of Miss Molly Hennessy," with a sly glance at Durgin, who colored, "to be drank at the expense of the house. Name your tops, gentlemen." "Snelling, me boy, you'd wint the bird from the bush with your beguiling ways. You've brought proud tears to the eyes of an aged parent, and I'll take a sup of that high-shouldered bottle which you kape under the counter for the gentlefolk in the other room." A general laugh greeted Mr. Hennessy's selection, and peace was restored. But the majority of those present were workmen from Slocum's, and the event of the afternoon remained the uppermost theme. "Shackford is a different build from Slocum," said Piggott. "I guess the yard will find out when he gets to be proprietor," rejoined Durgin, clicking his spoon against the empty glass to attract Snelling's attention. "Going to be proprietor, is he?" "Some day or other," answered Durgin. "First he'll step into the business, and then into the family. He's had his eye on Slocum's girl these 4 or 5 years. Got a cast of her fist up in his workshop. Leave Dick Shackford alone for lining his nest and making it soft all round." "Why shouldn't he?" said Stevens. "He deserves a good girl, and there's none better. If sickness or any sort of trouble comes to a poor man's door, she's never far off with her kind words and them things the rich have when they are laid up." "Oh, the girl is well enough." "You couldn't say less. Before your mother died," Mrs. Durgin had died the previous autumn, "I see that angel going to your house many a day with a little basket of comforts tucked under her wing. But she's too good to be praised in such a place as this," added Stevens. After a pause he inquired, "What makes you down on Shackford? He has always been a friend to you." "One of those friends who'll walk over your head," replied Durgin. "I was in the yard 2 years before him, and see where he is." "Lord love you," said Stevens, leaning back in his chair and contemplating Durgin thoughtfully. "There is marble and marble. Some is Carrara marble, and some isn't. The fine grain takes a polish. You can't get on to the other. Of course, he's statuary marble, and I'm full of seams and feldspar. You are like the most of us, not the kind that can be worked up into anything very ornamental." "Thank you for nothing," said Durgin, turning away. "I came from as good a quarry as ever Dick Shackford. Where's Torrini tonight?" "Nobody has seen him since the difficulty," said Dexter, "except Peters. Torrini sent for him after supper." As Dexter spoke the door opened and Peters entered. He went directly to the group composed chiefly of Slocum's men, and without making any remark began to distribute among them certain small blue tickets, which they pocketed in silence. Glancing carelessly at his piece of cardboard, Durgin said to Peters, "Then it's decided?" Peters nodded. "How's Torrini?" "He's all right." "What does he say?" "Nothing in particular," responded Peters, "and nothing at all about his little skylark with Shackford." "He's a cool one," exclaimed Durgin. Though the slips of blue pasteboard had been delivered and accepted without comment, it was known in a second through the bar-room that a special meeting had been convened for the next night by the officers of the Marble Workers' Association. End of chapter 13.